Hi everybody, thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of Timothy Keller's The Reason for God from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 8 and 9 of the book. Let's dive right in with chapter 8, which is titled The Clues of God. Keller opens the chapter by asking, how can we believe in Christianity without proof that its God exists? Well, despite the lack of irrefutable proof, Keller writes that many have discovered what he calls clues of God's presence. He also refers to these as God's divine fingerprints. Keller describes a nameless, brilliant young scientist with whom he used to talk, and how during their conversations Keller advised him to look at the various arguments for God not as proofs, but as clues. With that perspective, Keller says, the clues for God's existence seemed to gather a cumulative force. Does anyone else find it a little suspicious, this nameless, brilliant young scientist that Keller used to talk to? Anybody else think that this brilliant young scientist might also work as a professor at a prestigious Ivy League university? Just wondering. Keller cites Alvin Plantinga, who believes in the cumulative proof idea, these many arguments for God's existence all adding up to one great big arrow pointing in God's direction. No single argument will be compelling enough. No argument will be compelling to everyone, but if you consider them all, enough of them will be compelling enough to tip the scales, so to speak, toward the conclusion that God must exist. Keller describes several of these arguments, starting with the cosmological argument. Why is there something rather than nothing? And that's the question that this argument attempts to answer. Keller quotes both Stephen Hawking and Francis Collins, who agree that the evidence points overwhelmingly to a Big Bang at the beginning of the universe, but Collins, unlike Hawking, believes that the Big Bang, a point where the universe began to exist after previously not existing, implies that there must have been a creator. There must have been some sort of initial cause that preceded the Big Bang, and that the existence of that cause implies a creator. Keller makes William Lane Craig's argument that the cause of our natural contingent universe must have been something supernatural and non-contingent. But after making that argument, Keller admits that it doesn't get us to the God of the Bible. Even if we accept that the universe was created by some intelligent being, we still have no reason to think that we know anything at all about the personality or the will or the expectations or anything else of this being. Keller tries to squeeze around the problems with the cosmological argument by admitting that it's not a compelling argument all by itself, but merely a clue pointing to the possible existence of God. Now, personally, I don't see how a heap of bad arguments is any more compelling than one bad argument, but then again, I'm not an apologist. It's nice of Keller to admit that the cosmological argument doesn't get us to the God of the Bible, but if Keller were serious and wanted to be as honest as possible about this, he should have gone a step beyond that and admitted that hypothesizing someone or something being the cause of the Big Bang doesn't actually get us to any God. Suppose there was a first cause, something prior to the Big Bang that triggered the Big Bang to occur. And I realize the whole concept of prior to the Big Bang is problematic in and of itself, but let's just push on. From that assumption alone, that there was a cause that precipitated the Big Bang, what can you tell me about that cause? Was it a who or was it a what? Was it something that transcended all time and space, or was it just something that existed outside of the particular bubble of time and space which was created by the Big Bang, which we now call our universe? And if you have a specific answer to any of those questions, the follow-up question is, what makes you say that? How do you know? The only honest answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing is we don't really know. And while ignorance might be an explanation for belief in the existence of God in many cases, it's not evidence for the existence of any God, not even a little, no matter how much Keller wants us to think it is. From the cosmological argument, Keller moves to the fine-tuning argument, the probability that the conditions of the universe would be just right for our form of life to exist are so small, it's absurd to conclude that they got this way by accident. Keller says, quote, "As an argument, it must be a pretty powerful one, because there are a lot of fierce rebuttals being published about it. The most common rejoinder, which Richard Dawkins makes in his book The God Delusion, is that there may be trillions of universes." Well, if the number and ferocity of the rebuttals to an argument are an indicator of its power, then the arguments for a natural godless universe must be incredibly powerful as well, since for every book that argues in favor of atheism or naturalism, there seem to be several books published by evangelists and apologists seeking to repudiate it. Personally, I think the most powerful rebuttal to the fine-tuning argument is also the simplest. The universe isn't fine-tuned to us. We are adapted, not fine-tuned, to it. We exist in a universe that allows for us to exist. We fit within the space that is available for us. It's fun to philosophically ponder the possibilities if things were other than how they are, but to me it's no more of a mystery why we exist in this particular universe than it is why giant tube worms live near undersea hydrothermal vents. Life adapts to its environment, not the other way around. It's also worth mentioning, as Lawrence Krauss, among others, has done, that arguments appealing to the supposedly low probability of the universe having the particular set of constants that it does are meaningless because we don't know what the other possible values of those constants are, if any. Perhaps the possible values are essentially infinite, or perhaps their values in our universe are their only possible values, which would render any fine-tuning argument meaningless. And we don't know. Krauss also likes to remind theists making this argument that our universe is not only not fine-tuned for us, but it seems to be the worst of all possible universes in which we could exist. It's possible to hypothesize how the universe could be adjusted to make things better for our form of life, to make it easier for us to survive, to make the universe more hospitable to us. But it's difficult to imagine how conditions could be any worse and yet still allow for our existence in the universe. If conditions were any worse for our form of life, they would almost have to rule us out altogether. We live in the worst of all possible universes. Keller says, quote, "Although organic life could have just happened without a creator, does it make sense to live as if that infinitely remote chance is true?" Well, the argument is not that organic life just happened, and it's ignorant or disingenuous to suggest otherwise. Life is a product of long-running and incredibly complex reactions. Life itself is a process, is a series of reactions, and it didn't just happen any more than the stars just happened. And again, there's no basis for saying the chance of life evolving without help in some way from a supernatural creator is infinitely remote. In fact, I think we can assume it's exactly the opposite. We observe a universe that contains objects, including organisms, whose existences are allowed by the conditions of that universe. How can we say the chances of this are infinitely remote? Isn't this exactly what we would expect to see? Next, Keller considers the regularity of nature. Why is inductive reasoning possible? Why are the laws of physics constant? Why is nature, for the most part, regular and predictable? Keller says, quote, "As proof for the existence of God, the regularity of nature is escapable. You can always say, we don't know why things are as they are. As a clue for God, however, it is helpful. There he is with that clue versus proof distinction again. Here's the point Keller is missing. It's not important whether it's possible to reject a given argument. What matters is, should we reject that argument, or should we accept it? If you present something like the regularity of nature, or the supposed fine-tuning of the universe, or the existence of a first cause, as something that points toward the existence of God, but you can't explain why we should think it points that way, then that argument gets you nowhere. You can call it proof, you can call it just a clue, you can call it whatever you want. A bad argument is a bad argument. And saying we don't know the answer to this question, so it could be God, is a bad argument, no matter what question you're trying to answer with it. Keller moves on to his next clue of God, which is the argument from beauty. Quote, if we are the product of accidental natural forces, then what we call beauty is nothing but a neurological, hardwired response to particular data. Love, too, must be seen in this light. If we are the result of blind, natural forces, then what we call love is simply a biochemical response, inherited from ancestors who survived because this trait helped them survive. I can tell that Keller is uncomfortable with the idea that these concepts of beauty and love are ultimately natural in nature, but I'm not seeing a reason why I should reject that. Keller continues, quote, so what? Someone might object. Just because we feel something is true doesn't make it so. Are we, however, only talking about feelings here? What is evoked in these experiences is, more accurately, appetite or desire, which are forms of feelings. And how is it reductive to refer to something as a feeling if a feeling is, in fact, what it is? Those who make arguments like this will often sneer at physiological explanations for things like beauty or love. They'll describe the scientific concepts of these things in reductive, dismissive language. They'll imply or sometimes just outright assert that there simply must be more to it than chemical reactions or responses wired into our brains by evolution or experience. But why must there? If our appreciation of beauty or our feelings of love or the wonder we feel when contemplating great art or some sublime natural object or event really can be explained ultimately biochemically, and all signs point to that, how does that reduce those feelings? Why should we devalue those feelings if that is the case? Whether it's due to chemical reactions in my brain or some transcendent supernatural something, I love my wife just the same. I'm just as moved by a great film. I'm just as awed by the universe. The feeling themselves don't change. In fact, to me, knowing the true source of those feelings, knowing what they really are, that they are actually rooted in physical causes, makes them even more incredible. It doesn't reduce them at all. It's not reductive to accept the truth that we are physical, natural beings, that, as Christopher Hitchens used to say, we don't have bodies, we are bodies. I don't value my capacity to recognize beauty or feel love or be moved by a beautiful piece of music or laugh at a good joke because I think those responses must be rooted in something immaterial and eternal. I value them because of how they make me feel, because of how they add depth and color to my existence. Nailing them down as ultimately physical phenomena doesn't make them less real or any less important. And even if understanding beauty and love in physical terms was somehow reductive and did in some way diminish their value, it's irrelevant to the question of what they actually are. The argument Keller is making here is an appeal to consequences. I wouldn't like it if that's how things are, so things must be some other way. and no one who cares about the truth should ever be persuaded, even a little bit, by such an argument. Keller makes it plain before moving on. He says, quote, "We want something that nothing in this world can fulfill. Isn't that at least a clue that this something that we want exists?" I'm sorry, Tim, but no, it isn't. Time to grow up and start drawing our conclusions from the data and not the other way around. Okay? Oh, and as far as that "we want something that nothing in this world can fulfill" goes, please do speak for yourself. Contrary to what evangelists and apologists would have me believe, I happen to know from personal experience that not everyone has a God-shaped hole in their life. This life might be far from perfect, but it is capable of being joyous, fascinating, and yes, fulfilling, without imagining there's a God to magically impart some arbitrary purpose to it all. You figure out what you need in your life, Tim, because I've got it handled on this end. Keller turns to the so-called clue killer, which he says is evolutionary biology, or he says that other people say is evolutionary biology. If our tendency to believe in gods, among other superstitions, can be explained as a product of our evolution, then the clues Keller has spent the chapter describing amount to nothing. But not so fast, Keller says. He says, quote, "Evolutionists say that if God makes sense to us, it is not because he is really there, it is only because that belief helped us survive, and so we are hardwired for it. However, if we can't trust our belief-forming faculties to tell us the truth about God, why should we trust them to tell us the truth about anything, including evolutionary science? If our cognitive faculties only tell us what we need to survive, not what is true, why trust them about anything at all?" First, the fact that our cognitive faculties were evolved in order to help us survive rather than to tell us what is true in every given situation doesn't mean that those faculties are incapable of telling us what is true when we apply them to those kinds of questions. Second, and this is important, our cognitive faculties, our senses, our reason, give us tools with which to judge what is true, but it's the evidence that ultimately tells us what is true. The reason evidence is so important is because we do have some hardwired tendencies that, in the absence of good evidence, can lead us to come to erroneous conclusions. That's why our conclusions, in order to be reliable, must follow reasonably from the data. Keller can't escape his responsibility to show evidence for his claims by pointing out the occasional unreliability of our cognitive faculties. He still needs evidence, and I still find it very telling that he never seems to have any. Keller, of course, would argue that he does have evidence, the various clues that he's discussed in this chapter, plus one more thing, quote, "If we believe God exists, then our view of the universe gives us a basis for believing that cognitive faculties work, since God could make us able to form true beliefs and knowledge." Someone left a comment on the previous video in this series wondering how long it would be before Keller made the presuppositional argument. Well, it's coming, but he's not quite there yet. First, there's this bit of ground laying where he says that believing God exists gives us a reason to trust our cognitive faculties. Well, that's nice. I mean, it means absolutely nothing as far as whether or not God actually exists, but, I think it's nice that Timothy Keller has imagined for himself a nice, neat, consistent worldview. And really, when it comes right down to it, Tim, do you even care whether or not it's true? I mean, sure, you wrote this book, you proposed these arguments, these clues, as you call them, but they're just different phrasings of the same argument. You think it makes more sense, or it's more reassuring, or it just seems to you to be better if God exists. Therefore, you say he does exist. You're interested in justifying your beliefs, not in honestly determining whether they're actually true. And that's not something that someone does if they really care about the truth. That's something that someone does if they don't care about the truth or if they're afraid of the truth. And I don't know which one you are, but you sure don't give the impression of someone who gives a shit about the truth. Anyway, the pre-sub-argument, here it is. Keller says, quote, "In the next chapter, I want to do something very personal. I don't want to argue why God may exist. I want to demonstrate that you already know that God does exist. I'd like to convince the reader that whatever you may profess intellectually, belief in God is an unavoidably basic belief that we cannot prove but can't not know. We know God is there." Well, there you go. So let's go ahead and move right along to that next chapter. Chapter 9, the knowledge of God. Keller begins by returning to the subject of morality. He describes how he has observed the way modern people have very clear beliefs about what is right and what is wrong, but that these beliefs are free-floating rather than grounded in a solid base. He says, quote, "I think that people will definitely go on holding to their beliefs in human dignity even when conscious belief in God is gone. Why is this the case? I have a radical thesis. I think people in our culture know unavoidably that there is a God, but they are repressing what they know." Keller then spends the next several pages reiterating arguments that he made already in previous chapters of this book. Morality can't be relative because then we couldn't judge whether our morals were superior to some other set of morals. We know that moral standards exist outside of ourselves. We know that some things are simply right and some things are simply wrong, regardless of our opinions, etc. He's been over this ground before, as have countless apologists before him. And Keller dismisses the evolutionary explanation for morality as insufficient. He says that kin selection might make sense, but how do we account for our valuing of altruism and self-sacrificing behavior that benefits those outside of our family or our tribe? He says, quote, "If we see a total stranger fall in the river, we jump in after him or feel guilty for not doing so. In fact, most people will feel the obligation to do so even if the person in the water is an enemy. How could that trait have come down by a process of natural selection? Perhaps instead of treating your incredulity as evidence for something, you should ask an evolutionary biologist, or an anthropologist, or read a fucking book, and try to find out the answer to that question. You might read about the concept that morality is not 100% the product of biological natural selection, but of a combination of that process and cultural evolution, and that things like empathy and the benefits of cooperation and reciprocity probably played an important role in the development of moral ideas as well. And maybe if you did that, instead of pretending that you've answered the question merely by asking it, you might actually learn something. I'm just suggesting that you try it once and just see how you like it." Keller continues, quote, "This sense of moral obligation creates a problem for those with a secular understanding of the world." It doesn't, but let's just go with it. Keller describes the problem faced by an anthropologist he knew, who found herself offended by other cultures who oppressed women, but had difficulty justifying her offense because she felt she was judging another culture by her own Western values. Keller wonders what justifies the concept of human rights. It is considered wrong throughout the world today to violate the rights and dignity of another person, but why is that? What makes it right to respect human rights and wrong to violate human rights? On what does the concept of human dignity depend? Citing Alan Dershowitz, Keller summarizes three possible sources of our concept of human rights: God, nature, and man. And Dershowitz finds all three possibilities inadequate. Many people don't believe in God, and nature is shaped by natural selection, and the lives of wild animals are dominated by ruthless predation. And as for man as the source of human rights, Keller has this to say, quote, "Many argue that it is in the interest of societies to create human rights because honoring individual dignity means that in the long run, everyone in the community is better off. However, what if a majority decides it is not in their interest to grant human rights? If rights are nothing but a majority creation, then there is nothing to appeal to when they are legislated out of existence." There are two important points I want to make here. First, as he usually does when describing the position of those who disagree with him, Keller is grossly oversimplifying the concept of man-made morality. It isn't simply majority rules, and moral concepts aren't arbitrary ideas that we just sort of decide to abide by one day and feel free to dismiss the next. Our morality is as deeply rooted in our brains and in our societies as anything else in our culture, in our very being. The fact that our moral standards are derived from us, from our innate qualities, from our sense of community, from our experiences, from our ability to project ourselves into the experiences of others, doesn't somehow make them imaginary. As when he discussed love and beauty, Keller seems to think that these things can only be real if they are part of something transcendent and eternal. And I think that is just a silly and unjustified idea. Second, even if what Keller says about man-made morality is correct, there's still no reason to believe God, any God, let alone Keller's God, exists. Keller might argue that a God-sourced morality would be the only kind worth a damn, but that doesn't mean that's what we have. Keller argues that we all know that moral obligations exist, and since there is no adequate basis for moral obligations without God, we innately know God must exist, whether we admit it to ourselves or not. Do you notice what's missing there? Keller neglects to explain why the existence of moral obligations point to the existence of God. He quotes Arthur Leff and Friedrich Nietzsche on the problems we encounter when we wrestle with difficult moral questions with only our human morality to guide us. He asserts repeatedly that it makes more sense to assume God is the source of moral obligations that we recognize, but he never demonstrates why the existence of moral obligations necessitates the existence of God, and specifically his God. Whether they come from Keller's God, or from someone else's God, or from us, or from some pre-existing natural moral law, moral obligations do exist. They're real, and they influence our thoughts and behavior constantly. Keller needs to do more than point to them and say, well, where'd they come from if God didn't make them? Merely pointing to the existence of moral obligations and then describing the struggle we all face from time to time when grappling with difficult moral questions is not enough. Next, Keller turns to the violence of nature. Animals are amoral. They kill and eat each other with no sense of the rightness or wrongness of their actions. Survival seems to be their only guiding principle. Keller says, quote, "Yet we inescapably believe it is wrong for stronger human individuals or groups to kill weaker ones. If violence is totally natural, why would it be wrong for strong humans to trample weak ones? There is no basis for moral obligation unless we argue that nature is in some part unnatural." Well, sure there is. And by the way, before I get on with this, bravo for that nature must be unnatural bit at the end. And not only is it a blatant contradiction, it's also a stunning example of human arrogance. The way we do things must be the right way, which means all of nature is doing things the wrong way. Nicely done, Tim, and if I may say, very Christian of you. Now then, the difference between animals and us, or I should say between most other animals and us, is that we have moral awareness. We have consciousness. We have a sense of identity. We have the capacity for empathy. We have the capacity to look to the future, to anticipate the consequences of our actions. We are driven by instincts just the same as other animals, but unlike most of those other animals, we also have the ability to decide whether or not to act according to those instincts. We have the ability to reason. We have the ability to ponder our experiences and derive meaning from them. These abilities are all products of our evolution, biologically and sociologically, and none of them require us to assume the involvement of a god or anything supernatural to account for them. And by the way, we're probably not the only animals who have some of these abilities. So far as we can tell, we're the most advanced species in terms of morality and self-awareness and all the rest. But there is a great deal of evidence suggesting that other primate species recognize and enforce moral standards in their communities. And whales seem to do the same thing. Those are the most complex examples, but we can see simpler forms of the sorts of behaviors on which our morality depends in the lives of all sorts of social animals, from dogs and wolves to birds, all the way down to ants. Not that any of this would mean much to animals don't act like we do, so nature must be broken. Keller here. He says, quote, "There is only one way out of this conundrum. We can pick up the biblical account of things and see if it explains our moral sense any better than a secular view." Will we be reading the Quran, the Book of Mormon, the Bhagavad Gita, and the countless other religious scriptures that claim to be able to explain this as well? Or is this one of those times when we're pretending Christianity is the only religion? Because I get confused. Let me try to illustrate what Keller is doing here. Imagine, instead of our moral sense, that we're talking about something physical, like a tree. Let's say that I walk outside one morning and there's a tremendous tree growing in my backyard. And it wasn't there yesterday, and I have no idea how it got there. It is, at first glance at least, inexplicable. So, along comes Timothy Keller, and he says to me, I know where this tree came from. It was the tree fairy. She fluttered by last night, and she sprinkled her fairy dust, and the tree magically appeared. And when I asked Timothy Keller what evidence he has that his story about the tree fairy is what actually happened, he just points to the tree. And he says, "Doesn't the tree fairy make more sense than anything you've come up with?" He points out something real, something that we can all agree exists, the inexplicable tree or our sense of morality. Then he makes up a story or cites a story that someone else made up to explain where this thing came from, the tree fairy or God, and then he points to the real thing as evidence for the truth of his made-up story. How'd that tree get there if it wasn't for the tree fairy? How'd the Grand Canyon get there if Paul Bunyan didn't drag his axe behind him? If Romulus and Remus weren't real people raised by actual she-wolves, where'd Rome come from? Then, when someone offers a proper explanation for whatever his story is about, he points out the problems with the explanation, which may or may not be legitimate, and then he says, "See? My story's still better." And nowhere has he offered a scrap of evidence to substantiate his story. It is smoke and mirrors. Keller says, quote, "If you insist on a secular view of the world, and yet you continue to pronounce some things right and some things wrong, then I hope you see the deep disharmony between the world your intellect has devised and the real world and God that your heart knows exists. This leads us to a crucial question. If a premise, there is no God, leads to a conclusion you know isn't true, napalming babies is culturally relative, then why not change the premise?" First, if a premise leads to a false conclusion, the relevant question here isn't should we change the premise, but why should we accept Keller's premise? And again, he offers absolutely no support for his premise. Second, Keller can tell me that I know God exists in my heart all day long if it makes him happy. It doesn't make it true. Third, why isn't napalming babies culturally relative? I know Keller is appealing to emotion here. He's saying if there's no God, then people would be allowed to napalm babies, and you don't want that, do you? Well, no. I suppose not. But if we're talking philosophically here, why isn't the acceptance or condemnation of baby napalming culturally relative? How does my wish to not see babies napalmed count as evidence for the existence of some absolute transcendent standard forbidding baby napalming? Keller and other apologists are preoccupied with the ultimateness of things. To them, if something doesn't have ultimate meaning, then it has no meaning. If my life, my experiences, and the consequences of my actions don't last forever, then they are meaningless. If moral standards don't apply always to everyone, then they aren't real. But this view of things doesn't make sense to me. Even if we desire that sort of ultimate meaning, that doesn't mean it's available to us. I'd rather deal with the world as it is, not as I think it should be. I think it's childish to do otherwise. Also, just because I acknowledge that human morality is a human construct, that doesn't mean that I'm cool with babies being napalmed in a culture that tolerates such an act. And the fact that I think it's wrong, regardless of the morals of the culture of the baby napalmers, isn't evidence for some absolute morality. It's evidence for my morality. If I saw someone about to napalm a baby, I would feel obligated to intervene, not because of some transcendent moral standard that tells me my morals are better than theirs, but because of my moral standard, which is the one that I follow. I don't follow theirs, I follow mine. And mine tells me that it's better to disregard the morals of someone else and to act to defend a helpless person than to respect the morals of someone else and allow that helpless person to come to harm. And we can argue about the implications of that and of where I draw the line between intervening and standing by. And we can probably have a fascinating conversation. But the point is that I don't need an absolute moral standard to decide napalming babies is wrong. I just need a moral standard. Keller closes the chapter by contemplating the consequences of a godless universe. If there is no God and no afterlife, then our lives, and in fact the entire existence of our species, our planet, everything, is ultimately meaningless. Nothing we do makes any difference at all in the long run. Keller says, quote, "Once we realize this situation, there are two options. One is that we can simply refuse to think out the implications of all of this. We can hold on to our intellectual belief and yet live as if our choices are meaningful and as if there is a difference between love and cruelty. The other option is to recognize that you do know there is a God. You could accept the fact that you live as if beauty and love have meaning, as if there is meaning in life, as if human beings have inherent dignity, all because you know God exists. It is dishonest to live as if He is there and yet fail to acknowledge the one who has given you all these gifts." What I find to be dishonest or ignorant, take your pick, as usual, is to assert that things can only have meaning if they last forever, or if their meanings have been imparted to them from outside the natural order by some deity. The very concept of meaning is corrupted by this sort of thinking. If God isn't there to tell us what things mean, then they can't mean anything. If our lives don't last forever, then they are meaningless. I find this to be not only stupid, but obscene. Ideas like this offend me, because they are not only based on false beliefs, they are demeaning to the concepts that Keller claims to value. It's demeaning to beauty, to love, to morality, to human dignity, to say that these things which are so vital to our lives only have meaning if they are eternal and have been given to us, handed down to us from a higher being. The eternity that Keller posits as necessary for meaning and morality is an illusion. It has never been a part of our lives. Nothing lasts forever. Even the stuff we commonly refer to indicate something lasting forever. Even the sun will not always rise. Eventually, everything we have ever known will be gone, and everything we have ever done will be totally forgotten. I don't say that because I like it. I don't say that because I want things to be that way. I say it because I don't see any reason to assume anything else is going to happen. Our lives, our civilizations, our species, our planet, our star, even our universe itself are temporary. That's the way it is. And it doesn't matter how you feel about it. So my concepts of meaning, my concepts of love and beauty and purpose fit within that reality. They don't appeal to an ultimate existence which I have absolutely no reason to regard as anything other than imaginary, because I think that would be nonsensical and childish and foolish. Keller offers two options. Refuse to think out the implications of living temporary lives in a temporary world, or to pretend that we're going to last forever. There is a third option. To think out the implications and face them. It's not always easy, but if I want my life to mean anything to anyone for any length of time, it's the only option I can take. Well, that's it for this episode. That's it for chapters 8 and 9. I will be back in the next video in this series to cover chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is titled The Problem of Sin, and chapter 11 is titled Religion and the Gospel. So that's next time. That's it for this time. Thank you guys, as always, so much for watching. Please, please comment. Tell me where I went wrong. Tell me where I got it right. Agree, disagree, be you atheist, theist, whatever. I love to hear from you. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful that so many of you find this to be of use and of interest. And I'll see you next time.